Before empires, before the bloodlines of conquest, the world looked stable. But it was only an illusion. In the early 13th century, Eurasia was a fractured chessboard of kingdoms, caliphates, and warring states, each convinced its borders would hold, each blind to the storm forming beyond the horizon. While the great cities of Persia, China, and the Islamic world flourished in power and culture, far to the north, something far more unpredictable was taking shape. The Mongolian steppe was not a place of comfort. It was a place of survival. Endless grasslands, brutal winters, and clans locked in constant conflict forged a people hardened by nature itself. Here, strength was not a choice. It was law. And in this unforgiving land, a boy named Temujin would rise from exile, betrayal, and hunger to become Genghis Khan. In this chapter, you will witness the fragile world before the Mongol storm, the harsh landscape that shaped its future conqueror, and the early life of a man who would rewrite the map of human history. This is not just a story of conquest. It is the beginning of an empire born from silence and destined to shake the world. Before history could name an empire, one man learned how to make the world obey in silence. Tonight, we witness the rise of a boy from the endless steppes who transformed betrayal, survival, and war into the foundation of the greatest land empire in history. Chapter 1: The Child of the Steppes. In a land where the wind remembers every death and the earth keeps no names, a child was born who would one day make history kneel. There was no crown waiting for him, no prophecy written in stone, only the endless steppes, cold, unforgiving, and indifferent to human suffering. This was a world where survival was not a right, but a daily negotiation with hunger, weather, and the quiet violence of nature itself. The boy who would become known as Genghis Khan entered life under the name Temujin, born into a fractured clan where strength was the only language that mattered. His earliest memories were not of comfort, but of movement, constant relocation across vast, empty lands where shelter was temporary and safety even more fragile. His father's influence did not shield him for long. When that protection vanished, so did any illusion of stability. The world he knew collapsed quietly at first. Then all at once, loyalty dissolved, allies turned away, and a child who should have been protected instead found himself standing at the edge of abandonment, forced to understand a truth most never survive long enough to learn. Power does not inherit itself. It must be taken or rebuilt from nothing. The steppes offered no sympathy, only lessons. Wind that cut through flesh, nights that stretched endlessly without warmth, and a silence so complete it felt alive, as if the land itself was watching, waiting to see whether he would break or adapt. Temujin did not speak often in those years. Observation became his survival instinct. Every glance, every hesitation in others, every shift in tribal behavior became information, pieces of a larger puzzle he did not yet have the words to name. Where others saw chaos, he began to see structure. Where others saw exile, he began to understand opportunity. It was not strength that defined him yet, but awareness. A quiet, internal calculation, forming beneath the surface of fear and uncertainty. The kind of awareness that does not shout, but remembers everything. And somewhere in that silence, in the vastness of a land that erased most who crossed it, a transformation began that no one around him could recognize. Not yet, Because the steppes were not just raising a child, they were shaping something far more dangerous. Chapter 2: Betrayal that forged a king. Some betrayals do not break a man. They strip him down until only something harder is left standing in his place. It did not happen like a war. There were no marching armies, no thunder of steel, no warning that survival was about to be stolen in broad daylight. It came quietly, through the slow unraveling of trust inside the one place that should have held it together. Temujin learned this not as a lesson, but as a wound that refused to close. The world around him shifted without mercy. Those who once shared fire and food began to look at him differently, not as one of their own, but as something expendable. In the harsh logic of tribal life, loyalty was never absolute. It bent toward advantage, and when advantage changed sides, so did people. What followed was not simply abandonment, it was removal, a deliberate severing of belonging. The boy who had once moved through the steppes under the fragile protection of kinship was now left exposed to a world that no longer recognized him as anything worth protecting. There is a particular kind of silence that comes after betrayal. It is not empty, it is heavy, like the air before a storm that never arrives. In that silence, fear has room to grow, but so does something else, something colder and more patient. Captured and stripped of agency, Temujin experienced what powerlessness truly meant, not as theory, but as weight. Every decision taken without him, every boundary enforced without explanation, every moment reminding him that control was something others could take simply because they decided to. But even in confinement, observation did not stop. If anything, it sharpened. He began to see patterns in human behavior that others ignored, the way authority was maintained not only through force, but through expectation, how fear could be distributed like currency, how obedience often came disguised as survival. Escape, when it came, was not dramatic. It was not a moment of triumph, but of timing, of patience meeting opportunity in a world that rarely offered either. And when freedom finally returned, it did not feel like relief. It felt like distance, separating him from the version of himself that had once believed in safety. He did not return unchanged. Something fundamental had shifted. Trust, once natural, now required proof. Relationships were no longer assumed, they were tested. And beneath every future alliance lay an unspoken question. What would you become when loyalty no longer protected you? The steppes had already begun shaping him once. Now, betrayal finished the work. Chapter 3: The Making of Temujin. Great leaders are not born from unity. They are built in the impossible task of forcing broken worlds to stand together. After exile and betrayal, Temujin did not return to the steppes as a boy seeking restoration. He returned as something quieter, more deliberate, an observer of fractured loyalties and scattered tribes, each surviving in isolation but vulnerable in their separation. The land had not changed, but his understanding of it had. Power in the steppes was never centralized. It drifted between clans, shifting like dust in the wind, held together only by temporary advantage and fear of immediate destruction. No one ruled for long because no one could hold everything at once. Survival depended on fragmentation, but fragmentation also ensured weakness. Temujin saw the contradiction before anyone else dared to name it. He did not begin with conquest. He began with connection. Carefully chosen alliances formed not through shared blood, but through calculated necessity. Each agreement was fragile, but each one extended his reach further into the political fabric of the steppe. Where others demanded submission, he offered structure. Where others relied on tradition, he introduced loyalty tied not to ancestry, but to purpose. This shift was subtle at first, almost invisible, but it changed everything. Leadership in his hands was no longer inherited prestige. It was earned alignment. Those who followed him did so not because they were bound by lineage, but because they recognized a new kind of order forming beneath the chaos. It was not kindness that held them together, nor ideology. It was clarity, the certainty that under his direction, survival was no longer random. Yet unity alone was not enough. The steppes did not respect promises. They respected consequence. Temujin understood that loyalty without enforcement dissolves under pressure. So alongside alliance building came discipline, strict, unyielding systems that replaced uncertainty with consequence. Betrayal was no longer a distant possibility. It became a visible risk with immediate cost. Fear entered the structure not as chaos, but as architecture. Not uncontrolled violence, but predictable response. And within that framework, something unexpected happened. Loyalty began to stabilize, not out of affection, but out of recognition that order, however harsh, was preferable to collapse. For the first time, scattered tribes began to function as something resembling a unified force. Not a nation yet, not an empire, but a direction, a movement with intent. And at the center of it stood Temujin, not celebrated, not loved, but increasingly undeniable. What had begun as survival was no longer about enduring the world around him. It was about reshaping it. Chapter 4: The First War Cry. The first true war cry is never about victory. It is the moment the world realizes a new kind of fear has learned how to speak. It began not as legend, but as confrontation. Two forces colliding in a land where disputes were settled not in councils, but in blood. The tribes that once dismissed Temujin as an ambitious outlier now faced the consequences of underestimating a man who no longer measured time in hesitation. This was his first large-scale conflict, not a raid, not a skirmish, but a test of whether the fragile cohesion he had built could survive contact with resistance. When the moment arrived, there was no hesitation in his command. The silence that preceded battle was heavier than the clash itself, as if the land itself paused to observe what kind of violence would emerge from this new order. The opposing forces expected disorder. They expected fragmentation to collapse under pressure, as it always had. What they encountered instead was structure, disciplined movement, coordinated advance, and a level of precision that did not belong to the traditional steppe warfare they understood. Temujin's strategy was not driven by overwhelming numbers. It was driven by timing, by positioning, by the calculated disruption of expectation. He did not seek equal exchange of force. He sought imbalance. Every engagement was designed to fracture morale before it fractured bodies. And when the fighting began, it was not chaos. It was execution. There was a harsh efficiency to it, unsettling in its clarity. Units moved like extensions of a single intention. Resistance did not fade gradually. It collapsed in segments, as if confidence itself had been surgically removed from the battlefield. But what lingered after the clash was not the outcome. It was the memory of how it unfolded. Survivors did not speak of heroics. They spoke of inevitability, of a force that did not rage, but resolved. In that moment, something irreversible took shape. Temujin was no longer merely a unifier of tribes. He was becoming a reference point, a name that carried weight beyond his immediate presence. Rumors traveled faster than riders. Accounts grew sharper with repetition. Some described him as relentless, others as precise. All agreed on one detail. Confrontation with him did not feel like war as it had always been known. It felt like system replacing disorder. And as the steppes absorbed the shock of this new reality, one truth began to settle across distant camps and fractured clans alike. A leader had not only survived battle, he had redefined what battle meant. Chapter 5: The Birth of the Mongol Order. Empires are not born in victory. They are born the moment chaos learns how to obey a single system. After the first battles reshaped perception, Temujin did not allow momentum to drift into disorder. Where others would have celebrated conquest, he saw something more fragile beneath it. An army that could win but still collapse if left unchanged. Victory, in his eyes, was not proof of strength. It was proof of potential structure. What followed was not expansion, but reconstruction. The scattered war bands that had once followed him as temporary allies were no longer sufficient for what was coming. They were reorganized, broken apart, and rebuilt into units defined not by tribe, but by function. This was a radical departure from everything the steppes had known. Bloodline, once the foundation of identity, was no longer a guarantee of rank. Loyalty was no longer inherited, it was measured. Men who once held status by ancestry now found themselves judged by performance. Those who adapted rose quickly. Those who relied on lineage found themselves irrelevant in a system that no longer recognized tradition as authority. The change was not gentle, it was structural, absolute, and it forced a new kind of discipline to emerge, one that did not depend on fear alone, but on clarity of consequence and reward. Within this framework, communication became precision. Commands were no longer interpreted, they were executed. Hierarchies were flattened into functional layers, each accountable not to heritage, but to outcome. The battlefield began to resemble something closer to an engineered mechanism than a tribal clash. And as structure solidified, something unexpected happened. Efficiency replaced hesitation. The army began to move as if it had learned how to think collectively, responding to intent rather than confusion. Temujin did not seek loyalty in the traditional sense. He designed it through structure, through accountability, through a system where survival and advancement were tied to discipline rather than birthright. With this transformation complete, the Mongol forces were no longer merely a coalition of followers. They had become an order, defined, repeatable, and increasingly scalable. And once order exists in a place built on fragmentation, expansion is no longer ambition. It becomes inevitability. Campaigns began to stretch beyond familiar horizons. Distant tribes, once unaware of this growing force, now encountered it as something fundamentally different from anything they had prepared for. Resistance did not meet disorder. It met coordination. What began as unification within the steppes now extended outward, testing boundaries that had once seemed fixed. And at the center of it all, Temujin's vision sharpened into something unmistakable. Not a collection of tribes, not even a kingdom, but a system that could grow as long as there were worlds left unorganized. Chapter 6: The Shadow of Conquest. Long before the first arrow was fired, entire kingdoms were already breaking because fear had arrived ahead of the army. There was a change in the nature of resistance. It no longer looked like preparation. It looked like anticipation of collapse. As Temujin's forces expanded beyond the steppe, neighboring kingdoms did not encounter a familiar pattern of invasion. They encountered something more unsettling: the certainty of it. Borders that once felt permanent began to lose their psychological weight. Cities that had stood for generations started to feel temporary, as if history itself had shifted its attention elsewhere. The first signs were subtle: messengers who never returned, trade routes that fell silent, rumors that arrived faster than confirmation. But over time, those fragments formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. The enemy did not simply move, it preceded itself. By the time an army was visible, the real conquest had already begun. Temujin understood something others failed to grasp. Warfare was not only physical, it was informational. Perception could fracture stability before a single confrontation occurred. So campaigns were designed not just to defeat opposition, but to destabilize certainty. Stories of his army spread faster than his riders. They did not rely on exaggeration alone. They relied on repetition. Every account added weight to the same conclusion. Resistance was not just dangerous, it was statistically unwise. Survival in many cases meant submission before contact. In some cities, defense was abandoned before siege engines were even constructed. Leaders debated not how to win, but whether winning was still possible. The psychological landscape shifted faster than any map could be redrawn. When resistance did occur, it often lacked cohesion. Forces arrived already divided between duty and doubt. The battlefield, when it finally formed, was no longer the first point of contact. It was the final stage of a process that had begun elsewhere, in fear, in rumor, in anticipation. Temujin's strategy did not require constant engagement. It required presence without proximity. The idea of his arrival was often enough to alter decisions at a distance. In that sense, conquest became less about movement and more about inevitability. Entire regions began to adjust their behavior around expectation rather than reality. Alliances formed and dissolved based on projected outcomes rather than present strength. Even opposition started to behave like a reaction to something already decided. What made this shift so effective was not brutality alone, but consistency. The pattern reinforced itself. Resistance led to destruction, hesitation led to survival, and survival increasingly meant alignment. And so the shadow of conquest grew longer than the armies themselves. It stretched across kingdoms, not as a visible force, but as a changing understanding of power. By the time steel finally met steel, the outcome had often already been written in silence. Chapter 7: The Man Who Became an Empire. A man can be defeated, remembered, or forgotten, but an empire is something that continues even after the man disappears. There was no ceremony that could properly contain what was about to happen. No tradition within the steppes that could fully describe the moment when identity stopped being personal and became absolute. Temujin was no longer a name used within the limits of tribe or territory. He was recognized as Genghis Khan, a title that did not elevate him above others, but placed everything beneath a single point of authority. This was not a promotion in status. It was a transformation in definition. What had once been a man moving through fragmented alliances was now the center of a unified command that no longer depended on geography to exist. The system he had built no longer required his constant presence to function. It had learned continuity. And in that shift, something irreversible occurred. Power stopped being tied to personality and began operating as structure. Decisions no longer reflected the will of an individual alone. They reflected the momentum of an expanding order. What began as leadership had become something larger, something that could outlive hesitation, fatigue, and even absence. The world around him struggled to interpret what had changed. To some, it still appeared as conquest led by a single force of will. To others, it looked like a phenomenon that no longer had a center. Both interpretations were partially correct and completely insufficient, because what emerged was neither purely man nor purely machine of war. It was continuity disguised as command. Within this new reality, expansion was no longer an objective that required justification. It became a natural consequence of structure meeting unstructured space. Regions that had once resisted now measured survival not against strength, but against inevitability. Borders stopped being barriers and started behaving like temporary pauses in motion. The ideology itself had shifted. Where once the story centered on survival, then on unification, it now centered on permanence. The idea that fragmentation was the default state of the world had been replaced with a new assumption. That order, once formed correctly, should expand until it encountered something equal or greater. And nothing in the surrounding world had yet proven itself equal. There was no final victory moment that defined this transformation. No singular battle that could be isolated as the turning point. Instead, it was a gradual realization across distant lands that resistance no longer changed outcomes. It only changed timing. The empire did not arrive in a single form. It arrived in stages, each one reinforcing the last, each one making reversal more difficult than the one before. And at the center of it all, the man who had once survived abandonment, betrayal, and obscurity was no longer measured as an individual. He had become the structure through which history would now continue to move. This wasn't just an army. It was a system designed to break entire civilizations before the first arrow was fired. Tonight on Midnight Empire, we move beyond the rise of Genghis Khan to expose the machine he unleashed, an unstoppable force built on speed, strategy, and calculated terror that turned resistance into extinction across continents. Chapter 1. The day fear arrived. The battle hadn't begun, but the city was already lost. By the time the dust appeared on the horizon, the decision had been made. Not by generals, not by kings, but by fear itself. At first, it looked like a storm, a low, rolling cloud stretching across the open land, moving too fast to be natural. Then came the silence. Birds vanished, roads emptied. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. And then the whispers started. They're coming. No banners, no drums, no warning horns, just stories, carried faster than any army could ride. Stories of cities that resisted and vanished, of walls that meant nothing, of survivors who wished they hadn't survived at all. Inside the city, something shifted. Markets closed before noon. Merchants hid their gold beneath stone floors. Families gathered what little they could carry, unsure whether to flee or pray. Soldiers checked their weapons again and again, not out of readiness, but out of doubt. Because this enemy didn't behave like any they had faced before. They didn't siege for months. They didn't negotiate, and they didn't leave survivors to tell the tale, unless it served a purpose. Panic spread faster than fire. A single rider arrived before the army, calm, deliberate, no threats, no raised voice, just a message: surrender or be erased. Entirely, not conquered, not ruled, erased. And the terrifying part? Everyone believed him, because by the time the Mongols approached your gates, they had already fought the battle somewhere else, inside your mind. Commanders argued in hushed rooms. Some demanded resistance, clinging to honor, to walls, to the illusion of control. Others had heard enough stories to know how those choices ended. Every delay, every disagreement, only tightened the grip of dread. Outside, the dust grew closer. Not chaos, precision. The movement wasn't random. It was calculated, controlled. A force that understood exactly how fear worked, how it spread, how it paralyzed. This wasn't just an approaching army. It was a message. And that message was simple. You are already defeated. Some cities opened their gates before the first arrow flew. Others stood their ground, briefly. But in both cases, the outcome had been decided long before steel met steel. Because the Mongols didn't just fight battles, they engineered surrender. They turned rumor into a weapon, silence into pressure, and uncertainty into collapse. By the time they arrived, resistance wasn't a strategy. It was a delay of the inevitable. And as the first riders finally broke through the horizon, calm, focused, unstoppable, the city understood the truth too late. This was not the beginning of a war. This was the end of one. Chapter 2. The birth of a war machine. He didn't build an army. He rebuilt how armies worked. Long before the conquests that would shake continents, Genghis Khan made a decision that defied centuries of tradition. Blood would no longer decide power. In most armies of the time, loyalty was inherited. Noble families commanded. Status determined rank. And when pressure came, those fragile hierarchies cracked, because men fought for titles, not for each other. He tore that system apart. In its place, he created something colder, something precise. A structure where every unit was built on merit, discipline, and absolute accountability. 10 men formed a squad. 10 squads formed a company. 10 companies became a regiment, and each level answered for the other. If one failed, all paid the price. There were no exceptions. A soldier didn't fight beside his cousin or his brother. He fought beside the men he was assigned. Bonds weren't inherited. They were forged under pressure. Trust wasn't assumed. It was proven. And betrayal? It didn't just end your life. It erased your entire unit. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was design. Because when survival depends on the strength of the group, loyalty stops being optional. It becomes instinct. Training reflected that philosophy. Every rider learned to fight, scout, survive, and adapt. There were no rigid roles, no dependency on a single specialist. Each man could function as part of a whole, or as a fragment of it. Orders were simple, but execution demanded precision. Move, strike, disappear, no hesitation, no emotional interference. Discipline wasn't enforced through speeches, it was embedded through consequence. The system rewarded effectiveness and punished weakness without delay. And perhaps most importantly, leadership wasn't inherited, it was earned. Commanders rose because they proved they could lead under pressure, not because of who their father was. And if they failed, they were replaced immediately. No politics, no second chances. That created something rare in the medieval world. a command structure that actually worked in motion. Decisions flowed downward with clarity. Results flowed upward with accountability. There was no confusion, no fractured authority, no competing egos pulling the army apart. Just function, and within that function, something powerful emerged. Unity. Not the kind built on shared identity, but the kind built on shared survival. Every man understood his role. Every unit moved as one. And when they advanced, they didn't look like individuals seeking glory. They looked like a single organism, efficient, adaptive, relentless. This was the foundation. Before the speed, before the tactics, before the terror that would define their reputation, there was structure, a system engineered to eliminate weakness at every level. Because Genghis Khan understood something others didn't, an army doesn't become unstoppable on the battlefield. It becomes unstoppable long before it ever arrives. Chapter 3. Speed that defied reality. By the time you spotted them, they had already outrun your message. Across the open steppe, distance meant safety, until it didn't. Kingdoms relied on space as a shield, believing miles could buy time, that warning would always outrun danger. The Mongols erased that assumption. Their advantage wasn't just movement, it was sustained velocity. Every rider traveled with multiple horses, rotating mounts before exhaustion set in. While one horse slowed, another surged forward, fresh and ready. The army didn't pause to recover, it kept moving. What looked like a single force was actually a rolling system of endurance. Horses were managed like resources, not companions. Speed wasn't a burst, it was a constant. And that constant changed everything. Messengers sent ahead to warn neighboring cities often arrived too late. Or not at all. Supply lines that should have taken weeks to disrupt were cut in days. Armies that believed they had time to prepare suddenly found the enemy already at their doorstep. Not because they marched faster, because they never stopped. Day blurred into night, night into day. Movement continued under moonlight, through cold winds, across terrain others considered impassable. There was no fixed rhythm, no predictable pattern. The Mongols didn't operate on the enemy's timeline. They erased it. Exhaustion became a weapon. Opponents tried to match their pace, pushing soldiers beyond their limits, draining strength before battle even began. By the time combat was inevitable, one side was already worn down, physically, mentally, strategically. And the Mongols? They arrived ready. Then came the strike. Fast, coordinated, overwhelming. Their attacks didn't unfold like traditional battles. There were no slow advances, no drawn-out formations locking into place. Instead, they hit like a sudden break in the sky. Unexpected, forceful, impossible to contain. A unit would appear on one flank, then vanish. Another would strike from a different angle moments later. Confusion set in quickly as defenders struggled to understand what they were facing. It felt less like fighting an army and more like being caught in motion itself, because that's what it was. A system built on uninterrupted momentum. Every movement calculated to maintain pressure, to deny recovery, to keep the opponent reacting instead of thinking. There was no safe distance, no reliable escape window. Even retreat became dangerous, as pursuing riders closed gaps with relentless efficiency. Time, once a strategic asset, became a liability. The faster you tried to respond, the more you exposed yourself. The longer you waited, the less chance you had. And through it all, the Mongols maintained control. They chose when to appear, when to engage, when to disappear. not bound by terrain, not limited by fatigue, not constrained by expectation. To those who faced them, it didn't feel like war as they understood it. It felt like something else entirely. Not a force you could outmaneuver, not an enemy you could outlast, but a presence you could never quite catch and never outrun. Chapter 4: The Art of Deception. The moment you thought you were winning, that's when you lost. On the battlefield, clarity is everything. Knowing where the enemy stands, how they move, when to strike, that's what turns chaos into control. The Mongols took that clarity and shattered it. They didn't just fight their enemies, they manipulated them. One of their most devastating tactics looked like weakness, a sudden clash. Arrows exchanged. Then, without warning, the Mongol line would break. Riders would turn and flee, scattering across the field as if discipline had collapsed. To any watching commander, it looked like victory. The enemy pushed forward, faster, harder, confident, because retreat meant fear, and fear meant opportunity. But this wasn't fear. It was design. The fleeing riders weren't escaping, they were guiding, pulling their opponents out of formation, stretching their lines, creating gaps where structure once held firm. Pursuing forces, driven by adrenaline and the promise of triumph, abandoned coordination. Order dissolved into chase, and that's when the trap closed. From the sides, from behind, from positions that seemed empty moments before, Mongol units reappeared. Not scattered, not broken, positioned. Arrows rained in controlled waves. Communication flowed instantly across their ranks. What looked like chaos transformed into precision as each unit moved exactly where it needed to be. The enemy, now disorganized and exposed, had no time to recover. What felt like momentum became collapse. And the most dangerous part? It worked again and again, because it exploited something universal: belief. The belief that an enemy retreating is an enemy defeated. The belief that pressure creates victory. The belief that control, once gained, can't vanish in an instant. The Mongols weaponized those assumptions. They created illusions on the battlefield, scenes that looked familiar, predictable, safe to act on. And when their opponents responded the way any trained army would, they stepped directly into the outcome the Mongols had already prepared. Ambush wasn't just an event, it was a process. Positioning began long before the first arrow was fired. Terrain was studied, movement was calculated, timing was exact. Every piece fit into a larger design that remained invisible until it was too late. Even communication became part of the deception. Signals passed quickly across distances, allowing units to shift, adapt, and strike with coordination that felt impossible to counter. To those facing them, nothing made sense. Victory felt real, until it disappeared. Control felt secure, until it broke apart. Decisions that should have worked failed, because they were never truly in control. They were reacting to a script already written. And in that script, every advance led deeper into uncertainty. Every success opened the door to defeat. The Mongols didn't rely on strength alone. They relied on perception, on shaping what their enemies saw, believed, and acted upon. By the time the truth became clear, it didn't matter anymore. Because the battlefield wasn't just a place of combat, it was a stage. And the outcome had been decided long before the final move was made. Chapter 5: Fear as a Weapon. Before the first arrow flew, the outcome was already written. in rumor, in memory, in fear. The Mongols understood something few armies ever mastered. Terror could travel faster than soldiers. They didn't rely on it as a byproduct of war. They engineered it. Every campaign followed a pattern, one that seemed simple on the surface, but devastating in execution. A city would be approached, not with immediate destruction, but with a choice: surrender or be erased. Not conquered, not occupied, erased. The message was delivered clearly, without theatrics. No shouting, no spectacle, just certainty. And behind that certainty stood a reputation that made the threat believable. Because by the time this choice was offered, stories had already arrived. Stories of cities that resisted and vanished, of populations wiped out so completely that silence replaced memory, of destruction so total it didn't just end lives, it erased identity. And those stories weren't accidental, they were allowed to spread. In some cases, survivors were deliberately spared, not out of mercy, but purpose. They carried the message forward, describing what happened in vivid detail. Every burned structure, every lost life, every moment of helplessness. Fear became a signal, and that signal moved faster than any army could. So when the Mongols appeared at the gates, they weren't introducing themselves. They were confirming what people already believed. Inside those walls, the debate began immediately. Fight and risk total annihilation, or surrender and hope for survival. But even that hope was controlled, because surrender didn't guarantee safety. It guaranteed submission. Resistance, on the other hand, guaranteed something far worse. The consequences weren't uncertain, they were consistent, predictable. That predictability made the threat more powerful. There was no guessing, no false optimism, no belief that things might turn out differently this time. The pattern had been established, repeated, reinforced, and people understood it. Leaders faced impossible decisions: protect honor and lose everything, or preserve lives by yielding control. Each choice carried weight, but one carried finality. Many chose to open their gates, not because they lacked courage, because they understood the alternative. And that was the real victory. No battle, no casualties, no resistance to break, just surrender, delivered by fear alone. The Mongols didn't need to fight every city. They needed to make sure every city believed what would happen if they did. That belief became their most efficient weapon. It reduced the need for prolonged campaigns. It minimized uncertainty. It allowed momentum to continue without interruption. Because every surrendered city became another example, another warning, another story waiting to spread. And with each new story, the next target became easier to break. This wasn't chaos. It was control, applied before conflict, sustained through reputation, and reinforced through action. By the time the Mongols reached their destination, the battle had already taken place in the minds of those waiting behind the walls. And more often than not, that was the only battle they needed to win. Chapter 6: The Fall of Great Cities. The tallest walls in the world meant nothing when the enemy refused to fight them the normal way. For centuries, cities believed in stone. Walls were more than defense. They were identity, a symbol of permanence, of safety, of power that could withstand anything the outside world brought against it. But when the Mongols arrived, those assumptions collapsed, because they didn't treat fortified cities as barriers. They treated them as problems to be solved. The first shock was patience. Traditional siege warfare was slow exhausting, predictable. Armies would surround a city, cut supply lines, and wait, sometimes for months. Defenders could endure, believing time was on their side. The Mongols changed the equation. They didn't just wait, they adapted. Siege tactics became flexible, almost scientific. Engineers were incorporated from conquered regions, bringing knowledge of siege engines, early artillery concepts, and structural weaknesses in walls that had been considered unbreakable. Every city had a flaw. The Mongols made it their mission to find it. Sometimes it was direct pressure, relentless bombardment of a single section until cracks formed. Sometimes it was environmental manipulation, cutting water routes, starving supply chains, forcing internal collapse long before the gates were breached. And sometimes it wasn't even about breaking in. It was about breaking morale. Inside the walls, tension built quickly. Food supplies dwindled. Panic replaced discipline. Leadership fractured under pressure. The longer a siege lasted, the less unified the defense became. And the Mongols understood something critical. A city does not fall when its walls break. It falls when its people stop believing those walls will save them. Even heavily fortified cities, those that had never been breached in generations, began to show cracks not in stone, but in confidence. Then came coordination. Multiple units would surround a target from different angles, maintaining constant pressure. No relief, no escape routes, no moments of quiet. Even when no assault was happening, the presence itself was exhausting. Defenders were forced into a constant state of readiness, and readiness, over time, becomes fatigue. When the final assault came, it rarely felt like a dramatic climax. Instead, it felt like the end of something already decaying. Gates opened not because they were broken, but because holding them closed no longer made sense. Resistance collapsed from within before it ever failed from outside. And once a city fell, the pattern repeated. News traveled faster than rebuilding. Neighboring regions adjusted their behavior. Some prepared defenses. Others reconsidered resistance entirely. Each fall reinforced the same conclusion. Walls were no longer enough. Empires built on static defense began to unravel. Not because they were weak, but because they were rigid, designed for wars of the past, not for an enemy that refused to behave according to tradition. One by one, great cities, centers of culture, trade, and power, succumbed, not always in dramatic destruction, sometimes in surrender, sometimes in silence, but always with the same underlying truth. The idea of safety behind walls had been permanently broken, and as each empire lost another stronghold, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a series of isolated defeats, it was a structural collapse, and it was accelerating. Chapter 7: Why No One Could Stop Them. Every empire believed it had the answer, until it faced a force that rewrote the question entirely. History is filled with powerful armies, skilled generals, fortified kingdoms, expanding empires that believed their strength was permanent. Yet one force moved across continents with a consistency that defied expectation, not because it was invincible in the traditional sense, but because it never allowed the battlefield to stay traditional. By this point, the pattern was no longer hidden. It was visible in every direction. No single advantage explained their dominance. It wasn't just speed. It wasn't just strategy. It wasn't just fear. It was the combination. Each element amplified the others until resistance itself became unstable. Speed ensured that enemies never had time to organize. Strategy ensured that no position remained predictable, and fear ensured that many opponents never fully committed to resistance in the first place. Together, they created something that couldn't be measured by conventional military standards. Armies designed for single strengths, heavy infantry, fortified defense, prolonged sieges, found themselves mismatched against a system that refused to engage on familiar terms. There was no front line in the way they understood it, no predictable rhythm of war, no stable reference point to rebuild from. Even victories felt temporary, because winning a battle didn't guarantee stability. The next engagement could arrive from a different direction, under different conditions, with no warning pattern to prepare against. That unpredictability became its own pressure. Commanders began to hesitate, not because they lacked courage, but because certainty itself had been removed from the equation. Every decision carried unknown consequences. Every movement risked triggering a response they couldn't fully anticipate, and hesitation in warfare is costly. Meanwhile, the Mongol system did not rely on singular genius in the field. It relied on consistency across scale. Units functioned independently, yet remained coordinated. Communication was fast, flexible, and adaptive. If one approach failed, another was already in motion. If one region resisted, pressure shifted elsewhere. The system didn't break under setbacks, it redistributed them. And at the center of it all was a philosophy that removed hesitation entirely from their side. Act decisively, move continuously, exploit uncertainty. Opponents, meanwhile, were forced into the opposite rhythm. React, adjust, recover, repeat. That imbalance alone was enough to destabilize even the strongest defenses. But the final layer wasn't tactical, it was psychological. By the time most enemies fully understood what they were facing, they were already operating inside a cycle of defeat. Disrupted logistics, fragmented alliances, collapsing morale, and unpredictable pressure from multiple directions. The battlefield stopped being a place of confrontation. It became a place of exhaustion. And exhaustion, when sustained, becomes surrender. So the question of why no one could stop them doesn't have a simple answer. It wasn't a single innovation or a singular leader or a moment of brilliance. It was the alignment of multiple forces into a single system that continuously reinforced itself. Speed that denied preparation, strategy that denied predictability, fear that denied resistance. And when those elements converged, the result wasn't just military superiority, it was inevitability. Empires didn't fall because they were weaker. They fell because the rules they depended on no longer applied. And in that gap between old logic and new reality, an unstoppable dominance took shape. The Mongols didn't just conquer land, they reshaped the logic of war itself. And in that brief moment of history, the world learned a brutal truth. When fear, speed, and strategy move as one, even empires stop feeling permanent. An empire doesn't become global by expanding its borders. It becomes global by dissolving the idea of borders altogether. Tonight on Midnight Empire, we follow the rise of the Mongol dominion beyond conquest and war, revealing how Genghis Khan and his successors built the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching across continents, cultures, and civilizations. Chapter 1. The map begins to change. What looked like isolated invasions was actually the beginning of the world being redrawn, one territory at a time. For most of history, empires expanded in visible waves. Borders shifted slowly, predictably, marked by clear campaigns and formal declarations. Maps changed, but only after long periods of conflict and consolidation. Then something unusual began to happen. Regions separated by vast distances started falling under the influence of a single expanding force. Not through random conquest, but through a pattern, rapid, coordinated, and unsettlingly consistent. What made it difficult to understand at first was scale. These were not neighboring kingdoms collapsing into each other. These were distant regions, each with its own defenses, culture, and political structure, suddenly drawn into the same expanding system of control. And at the center of that system was the legacy of Genghis Khan, a foundation that would later evolve far beyond its origin. The early phase wasn't about drawing lines on a map. It was about removing resistance from key points that connected regions together. Once those points were controlled, movement between territories, of armies, goods, and information shifted direction. The map didn't just expand outward. It started to reorganize itself. Trade routes that had existed for centuries were suddenly under unified control. Caravans no longer moved through fragmented jurisdictions, but through a single dominant system. This didn't just change commerce, it changed communication. News, ideas, and influence began traveling faster and more predictably across vast distances. Cities that once operated independently found themselves linked by the same administrative and military logic. Local rulers were replaced or subordinated, not always through destruction, but through integration into a larger framework of governance. And that framework didn't rely on constant destruction to maintain control. It relied on connectivity. The empire functioned less like a collection of conquered lands and more like a connected network. Each region played a role, supplying resources, securing routes, maintaining order, or acting as strategic points for further expansion. As this system grew, the perception of distance itself began to change. What once felt like separate worlds, East Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, started to feel interconnected under a single expanding influence. For the first time, the idea of a truly continuous land empire was becoming reality. But the transformation wasn't purely political, it was structural. Administrative systems adapted to manage vast territories. Communication methods evolved to maintain coordination across thousands of miles. Even cultural exchanges began to emerge in unexpected ways as people, goods, and knowledge moved along stabilized routes. Still, from the outside, what people saw was simpler: expansion without pause. One region after another aligning under the same overarching system. And with each addition, the map changed not just in shape, but in meaning. It was no longer a collection of separate kingdoms and empires. It was becoming something unified, something unprecedented in scale. And the world, without fully realizing it yet, was beginning to operate under a new geography. One defined not by distance or division, but by connection. Chapter 2: The Expansion Engine of the Mongols. This wasn't expansion by chance. It was expansion by design, running like a machine that never ran out of momentum. Empires usually grow in stages. They conquer, stabilize, rebuild, then expand again. There are pauses, moments where control is consolidated before the next move begins. But the Mongol system broke that rhythm entirely. Under the framework that emerged from Genghis Khan and his successors, expansion stopped being a sequence of campaigns and became a continuous process. There was no clear end to one conquest before the next began. Instead, multiple operations unfolded at once across different regions, managed as parts of a single coordinated system. This was the engine. At its core, it was built on decentralization with strict control. Local commanders were given autonomy to act quickly, but they operated within a unified strategic vision. That balance, freedom in execution, discipline in direction, allowed the empire to move faster than traditional centralized states could respond. While one front secured territory, another was already advancing. While one region was being integrated, intelligence from another was shaping the next move. Nothing waited. Everything overlapped. Speed alone wasn't the advantage. It was continuity. Most empires lose time between phases, communication delays, logistical breakdowns, political disputes. The Mongol system reduced those gaps to nearly zero. Orders didn't sit in bureaucratic chains. They traveled through streamlined communication routes designed for rapid execution. But the real strength of the expansion engine wasn't just military, it was structural absorption. Once a region was brought under control, it wasn't simply left as a conquered territory. It was immediately integrated into the broader system. Resources were redirected, local leadership was adjusted, and infrastructure was connected to the larger network. This prevented stagnation. Every new addition didn't slow the empire down, it accelerated it. Each conquered region became a new launch point for further expansion. And because the system relied on mobility and coordination rather than static occupation, it didn't suffer from the typical slowdown that destroys large empires over time. There was no long pause for rebuilding before the next movement. Expansion and governance operated simultaneously. The effect was cumulative. The larger it became, the faster it moved. And that is what made it so difficult for surrounding powers to comprehend. They were not facing a traditional empire that expanded in waves. They were facing a system that behaved like a chain reaction, each success triggering the next phase of growth. Resistance was often localized and fragmented, while the expansion engine operated on a continental scale. By the time one region understood what had happened to its neighbor, the system had already moved forward. What made this even more effective was adaptability. The structure was not rigid. It absorbed new administrative practices, local knowledge, and logistical improvements from each region it incorporated. Instead of breaking under complexity, it evolved with it. And so the empire didn't just spread across land, it learned as it spread. This is what turned expansion into something unprecedented in history, not a series of victories, but a self-sustaining mechanism that turned every conquest into fuel for the next one. And once that mechanism reached full operation, stopping it was no longer a matter of defeating an army. It meant interrupting a system that had already learned how to keep moving without pause. Chapter 3: The Silk Road becomes an empire network. What once connected traders became the bloodstream of an empire that spanned continents. Before the Mongol expansion, long-distance trade existed, but it was fragmented. Caravans moved through a patchwork of kingdoms, each demanding taxes, permissions, and protection. Every border added risk, every passage slowed progress. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a fragile chain of routes held together by negotiation and instability. Then the structure of power changed. As the territories unified under the expanding Mongol system, shaped by the legacy of Genghis Khan, something unexpected happened. Trade stopped being an external activity and became internal infrastructure. The empire did not merely control trade routes, it absorbed them. What had once been a dangerous journey across competing jurisdictions was transformed into a regulated corridor of movement. Security along major routes became systematic. Caravans no longer navigated dozens of local rulers. They moved through a single governing framework that prioritized flow over fragmentation. Merchants adapted quickly. For the first time, goods could travel across immense distances with a level of consistency that had previously been impossible. Silk, spices, metals, textiles, and ideas began to move not as isolated exchanges, but as part of a continuous exchange system. The empire benefited, but so did the network itself, because control over such a vast trade system required more than military presence. It required administration. Stations were established at intervals to support movement, places where travelers could rest, resupply, and continue without interruption. Communication across regions became more reliable, enabling faster coordination between distant points. But the most significant transformation was not logistical, it was informational. As merchants traveled, they carried more than goods. They carried knowledge, scientific ideas, cultural practices, technologies, and stories began to move along the same routes. Regions that had once developed in relative isolation were suddenly part of a shared flow of information. The empire became a connector, even when its origins were rooted in conquest. This connectivity created a new kind of stability, not based solely on force, but on interdependence. Cities along these routes became economically integrated into a larger system. Their prosperity depended not only on local production, but on their position within the broader network. And that dependence reinforced the structure itself. If disruption occurred in one region, it affected the entire chain. That meant maintaining order was not just a military priority, it was an economic necessity across the system. What emerged was something unprecedented, a continental-scale network where movement was as important as territory. Trade no longer simply crossed empires, it operated within them. And as this system matured, the boundaries between regions began to blur. Distance mattered less than connectivity. A merchant in one part of the empire could engage with markets thousands of miles away under relatively consistent conditions. This was not just expansion of land, it was expansion of interaction. The Silk Road, once a fragile thread between civilizations, had become a structured network embedded within an empire that stretched across continents. And in that transformation, the world did not just grow larger, it grew more connected than it had ever been before. Chapter 4: Governors, Not Kings: How Control Worked. The empire didn't collapse under its own size because it never tried to rule like one. At the height of its expansion, the Mongol system faced a problem that had destroyed countless empires before it: distance. When territory stretches across continents, direct control becomes impossible. Communication slows, authority weakens, local power fills the vacuum. Most empires respond by tightening central control, an approach that eventually breaks under its own weight. The Mongol system moved in the opposite direction. Under the political framework shaped by Genghis Khan, authority was not concentrated in a single continuous chain of royal command. Instead, it was distributed through a network of governors, administrators, and regional overseers who acted on behalf of the central authority, but not as independent rulers. They were not kings, and that distinction mattered. Kings rule through legacy, lineage, and symbolic legitimacy. Governors in the Mongol system ruled through appointment, performance, and accountability. Their authority was conditional, not inherited. And because it was conditional, it was also replaceable. This created a different kind of control, one that did not rely on deep local loyalty to a dynasty, but on the constant alignment of function with expectation. Regions were divided not just geographically, but administratively. Each governed unit was responsible for maintaining order, ensuring tax flow, supporting infrastructure, and reporting upward through structured communication channels. Failure was not tolerated as a slow political problem. It was corrected rapidly. This prevented the formation of semi-independent power centers that often emerge in large empires. Local leaders could not easily transform their positions into hereditary rule because their authority was always externally validated. But control was not only enforced through structure, it was supported through mobility. Inspectors, envoys, and officials moved continuously between regions. No territory remained isolated long enough to develop unchecked autonomy. The system was designed so that oversight was always in motion, always reconnecting distant parts of the empire back to its central logic. This created a paradox, an empire that was vast in scale, but tight in coordination. And because governors were accountable rather than sovereign, they functioned more like operators within a system than rulers of independent domains. Their success depended on alignment, not ambition. Economically, this structure ensured consistent extraction and redistribution of resources across regions. Politically, it reduced fragmentation. Strategically, it maintained readiness across multiple fronts without requiring constant direct intervention from the center. Most importantly, it allowed the empire to scale without dissolving into chaos. Each governed region acted as a node in a larger framework. If one node weakened, others compensated. If one governor failed, replacement was swift. The system did not depend on any single individual holding permanent control. And that is why size did not become a weakness. Because governance was not a fixed throne, it was a distributed mechanism. In traditional empires, distance creates decay. Authority fades as it moves outward. In this system, authority was designed to travel, continuously reinforced, continuously corrected, continuously synchronized. Control did not mean ruling every corner directly. It meant ensuring that every corner operated within the same structure of expectation, discipline, and function. And as long as that structure held, the empire did not need kings in every land. It only needed governors who understood that they were part of something larger than their own territory and could be replaced the moment they forgot it. Chapter 5: A World Connected by Conquest. For the first time in history, distance didn't separate civilizations. It linked them through a single expanding system of power. By the time the Mongol expansion reached its full scale, the impact was no longer just territorial, it was structural. Regions that had once evolved independently were now operating within a shared framework of movement, exchange, and coordination. What emerged was not just an empire spread across land, but a connected world shaped by that spread. The foundation laid by Genghis Khan had evolved far beyond military conquest. It had created conditions where interaction between distant civilizations became routine rather than exceptional. East and West, previously separated by vast physical and political barriers, were now part of overlapping systems of trade, administration, and communication. Goods, people, and knowledge moved through routes that were no longer fragmented by competing authorities at every stage. This connectivity did not erase differences between regions. Instead, it allowed those differences to interact on a scale previously impossible. Technologies developed in one area could influence production methods in another. Medical knowledge, agricultural practices, and engineering concepts began to circulate across vast distances. Cultural exchange followed naturally, not as a planned outcome, but as a consequence of sustained interaction. Merchants, envoys, and travelers carried ideas along with commodities. Cities along major routes became points of convergence, where multiple traditions intersected and adapted. The result was not uniformity, but acceleration. Societies evolved faster because they were no longer isolated from external influence. Innovations spread more efficiently. Failures were observed and corrected across regions more quickly than before. But this level of connection required stability, and stability required enforcement. To maintain uninterrupted movement across such a vast system, infrastructure and security had to operate at scale. Roads, relay stations, and protected corridors ensured that travel remained consistent. Communication channels were reinforced so that information could move across continents with reduced delay. This transformed the nature of power itself. Control was no longer defined solely by possession of land. It was defined by the ability to regulate movement across that land. Whoever managed the flow of goods, information, and people effectively shaped the rhythm of the entire system. As a result, even distant regions that had not experienced direct conquest found themselves influenced by the structure of the empire. Their economies adjusted to trade routes. Their political decisions accounted for broader connectivity. Their development became linked to systems far beyond their original boundaries. And while the empire itself remained rooted in military origins, its long-term impact was fundamentally integrative. It created a space where previously disconnected civilizations could interact continuously, not sporadically. For the first time, the world began to function less as a collection of isolated centers and more as a connected network of interdependent regions. This did not mean harmony, it meant interaction at scale. And interaction at scale changes everything it touches. Because once civilizations begin to operate within the same flow of exchange, they no longer develop in isolation. They evolve together, whether they intend to or not. Chapter 6: Europe, Asia, and the Shock of Contact. Two worlds that had developed separately for centuries suddenly found themselves forced into the same historical conversation. For much of recorded history, Europe and Asia evolved along different trajectories. Ideas, technologies, and political systems developed within relatively contained spheres, with only limited and indirect exchange between them. That separation ended abruptly. As the Mongol expansion reached its widest extent under the system established by Genghis Khan, regions that had previously existed at the edges of each other's awareness were suddenly drawn into direct contact. Not gradually, not cautiously, but through rapid and disruptive integration. The shock was not only military, it was informational. European societies encountered a scale of mobility and coordination that was difficult to interpret through their existing frameworks. Armies, messengers, merchants, and envoys moved across territories with a level of consistency that challenged established assumptions about distance and fragmentation. At the same time, Asian political and economic systems were interacting with European structures in ways that had never occurred before at such intensity or scale. What made this contact particularly significant was not just the exchange itself, but its speed. Ideas that once took generations to travel now moved within years. Technologies, administrative practices, and commercial methods began circulating across regions that had previously remained disconnected. This created a period of rapid adjustment on both sides. European regions began to incorporate knowledge that expanded their understanding of geography, trade, and governance beyond local experience. Maps changed. Perceptions of distance changed. Even political expectations began to shift as awareness of larger systems became unavoidable. In Asia, the integration of distant Western regions introduced new materials, goods, and cultural influences into established networks, further expanding the complexity of exchange already in motion. But this was not a balanced encounter. It was a restructuring of awareness. For the first time, civilizations that had considered themselves central within their own worldview were forced to recognize the existence of broader, interconnected systems that extended far beyond their traditional boundaries. Trade routes that once functioned as linear connections became multi-directional networks. Information no longer flowed in a single, predictable direction. It circulated, accumulated, and redistributed across multiple centers simultaneously. This shift altered more than commerce. It changed perception. Distance was no longer just physical, it became relational. What mattered was not how far something was, but how connected it was within the larger system. And within this system, previously isolated regions began to operate with a new awareness of global interdependence. The presence of Mongol-controlled corridors of movement did not erase cultural or political differences. Instead, it forced those differences into closer contact than ever before. That contact generated both exchange and tension, innovation and disruption. Empires and kingdoms had to reassess their understanding of power in a world where external influence could no longer be ignored or contained at regional boundaries. And at the center of this transformation was a simple but profound reality. The world was no longer divided into separate stages of history. It was now part of a shared, accelerating system of interaction, where events in one region could reshape conditions in another with unprecedented speed. Europe and Asia did not simply meet. They collided into a new reality of connection that neither side had fully anticipated, but both were forced to adapt to. And that adaptation would shape the trajectory of global history far beyond the period in which it began. Chapter 7: The Empire That Couldn't Stay One Place. The greatest empire in history didn't fall because it was attacked. It faded because it refused to stand still. At its peak, the Mongol dominion was unlike anything the world had seen. It stretched across continents, connected civilizations, and reshaped the flow of trade and communication. Yet beneath its vast reach lay a structural truth that would define its long-term fate. It was built for movement, not permanence. The system initiated under Genghis Khan had been designed around expansion, coordination, and connectivity across distance. It excelled at linking regions, managing diversity, and maintaining control over vast territories through flexible governance. But scale introduces a new kind of challenge: stability over time. As generations passed, the very mechanisms that enabled expansion began to face a different test: preservation. Managing a moving system across continents required constant adaptation, but maintaining cohesion across established territories demanded something else entirely: rooted identity and long-term institutional continuity. And that shift was not easy to sustain. The empire was not a single, unified capital projecting power outward. It was a distributed structure where authority, culture, and administration were spread across vast regions. That distribution had once been its strength. Now it became a source of divergence. Different regions began to evolve along different paths. Local priorities started to influence governance more strongly. Communication, though still functional, could not enforce the same level of synchronization that had defined the earlier phase of rapid expansion. What had once moved as a coordinated system gradually began to function as interconnected but distinct parts. This transformation did not happen abruptly. It unfolded over time, through subtle shifts in administration, regional autonomy, and local adaptation. Each part of the empire remained connected to the larger structure, but those connections became less uniform and more varied in practice. The result was not immediate collapse, but gradual differentiation. Regions that had once moved in tight coordination began to respond to local conditions more independently. Economic priorities diverged. Political structures adapted to regional realities. Over time, the sense of operating as a single, continuous system weakened. Yet the legacy of its earlier structure remained visible. Trade routes still functioned. Cultural exchanges still occurred. Information still traveled across distances that had once seemed impossible to connect. The foundation of connectivity persisted, even as centralized cohesion softened. This duality defined the later stage of the empire's existence: connected, but no longer singular; vast, but no longer unified in the way it once had been. The very qualities that made the empire extraordinary, its scale, its flexibility, its mobility, were also the reasons it could not maintain a fixed form indefinitely. It was engineered for expansion and integration, not for static permanence. And so, instead of a sudden end, what emerged was a transformation. The empire did not simply disappear. It redistributed itself into successor states, regional powers, and enduring trade networks. Its influence continued through the systems it had established, even as its centralized structure dissolved. In many ways, its greatest legacy was not territorial dominance, but the framework it left behind: a world more connected, more interactive, and more aware of its own scale than ever before. And that is the final paradox of the Mongol era. It created one of the most unified continental systems in history, yet it was never meant to remain in a single, fixed place. Because it was never just an empire of land. It was an empire of motion. The Mongol Empire didn't just redraw the map. It changed how the world moves, connects, and understands power. And long after its borders faded, its system of connection kept shaping history in ways no empire could fully control. In the heart of the Islamic Golden Age stood a city of unmatched power, knowledge, and wealth: Baghdad. A city where libraries held the wisdom of centuries and rivers carried the dreams of civilizations. But in 1258, everything changed. A storm was coming from the east, silent, unstoppable, and merciless. When it arrived, it would not just conquer a city, It would erase an era. This is the story of the Siege of Baghdad, 1258, the darkest moment in the rise of the Mongol Empire. Baghdad was not just a capital, it was the intellectual and cultural heart of the medieval world. The Abbasid Caliphate had ruled for centuries, shaping science, philosophy, medicine, and art. But when the Mongols arrived under Hulagu Khan, led by the unstoppable legacy of Genghis Khan, history entered its most brutal chapter. This episode uncovers how one of the greatest cities in human history fell within days, and why its destruction still echoes through time. Chapter 1: The City of Infinite Knowledge. They called it the city where the world came to think. At a time when much of Europe was still struggling through fragmented kingdoms and limited literacy, there stood a place that felt almost unreal: Baghdad. Not just a capital, but a living archive of human thought, where ideas from India, Persia, Greece, and Arabia collided and transformed into something greater than any single civilization could produce. By the 12th and early 13th century, Baghdad was not merely wealthy, it was intellectually dominant. Its streets were lined with scholars debating astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Merchants from distant lands filled its markets, carrying silk from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. But the true treasure of the city was not in its trade routes or palaces, it was knowledge. At the center of this intellectual universe stood the legendary House of Wisdom. More than a library, it functioned as a global translation and research institute centuries ahead of its time. Greek philosophical works were translated into Arabic, Indian mathematical concepts were refined, and Persian medical knowledge was expanded and preserved. Scholars here were not just copying texts, they were actively questioning, improving, and building upon them. Mathematics in Baghdad had already advanced beyond basic arithmetic into algebraic reasoning. Medicine was practiced with systematic observation, not superstition. Astronomers mapped the skies with precision that would later influence European Renaissance science. In many ways, Baghdad was functioning as the intellectual engine of the medieval world. But what made this city extraordinary was not just its institutions, it was its mindset. Knowledge was not restricted by borders, religion, or ethnicity. Scholars from different faiths worked side by side. A Christian physician could collaborate with a Muslim astronomer, while Jewish philosophers contributed to the same intellectual discussions. In an era defined elsewhere by division, Baghdad briefly embodied intellectual unity. The Abbasid court also played a crucial role in sustaining this ecosystem. Caliphs were not only political rulers, but patrons of science and literature. Libraries were funded on a scale unseen in other regions, and scholars were often rewarded with gold equal to the weight of their translated manuscripts. Books were treated as currency of civilization. Yet beneath this brilliance, the world outside Baghdad was changing. The steppe armies of the East were unifying under a force that valued speed, strategy, and conquest over preservation. Trade routes that once carried knowledge were now also carrying rumors of an army that could move faster than messages and strike harder than any empire could prepare for. Still, inside Baghdad, life continued with confidence. Scholars debated under candlelight, poets recited verses in royal courts, astronomers charted constellations as if the future itself was stable and predictable. The city believed, perhaps too strongly, that knowledge alone could protect it from destruction. What it did not yet understand was that history does not always respect centers of learning. Sometimes it moves like a storm, blind to beauty, indifferent to wisdom, and focused only on force. And somewhere beyond the horizon, that storm was already rising. Chapter 2: The Fractured Islamic World. Power rarely collapses in a single moment. More often, it quietly erodes from within, until the surface that once looked unshakable suddenly feels hollow. By the 13th century, the world of Baghdad was no longer the unified center of authority it once had been. The Abbasid Caliphate still existed in name, but its reality had changed. The vast Islamic world that once moved under a shared political and spiritual structure had gradually splintered into competing regions, ambitions, and loyalties. At the heart of this fragmentation was the weakening authority of the Caliph in Baghdad. The Abbasid ruler still held symbolic religious legitimacy, but real political power had been steadily diluted over generations. Military commanders, regional governors, and emerging dynasties now operated with increasing independence. What remained in Baghdad was more ceremonial than absolute. The city itself reflected this internal imbalance. While its scholars and merchants continued their daily rhythm, the political system above them had become fragile and reactive. Decisions that once shaped continents were now slowed by court rivalries, corruption, and competing factions within the ruling elite. One of the most significant structural weaknesses of this era was the reliance on external military forces. The Abbasid administration increasingly depended on professional soldiers who were not deeply tied to the city's cultural or political identity. This created a dangerous disconnect. Those who defended the city did not always feel bound to its survival. Outside Baghdad, the broader Islamic world was equally divided. Rival powers controlled Egypt, Syria, Persia, and Central Asia, each pursuing their own interests rather than a unified defensive strategy. Diplomatic coordination was inconsistent, and trust between regions had eroded over time. In practical terms, there was no single coordinated response system to an external existential threat. At the same time, internal court politics in Baghdad became increasingly unstable. Power struggles among advisors, military commanders, and bureaucrats weakened decision-making. Instead of long-term strategic planning, short-term survival politics began to dominate the ruling environment. Intelligence reports from border regions were often delayed, dismissed, or politically filtered. This fragmentation was not immediately visible to the public. Markets still functioned, scholars still wrote, and the city maintained its cultural brilliance. But beneath that surface, the mechanisms of unity were failing. The empire was no longer acting as a single body. It had become a collection of disconnected parts. Even communication across regions suffered. Messages that once traveled efficiently across the Islamic world now faced delays, disruptions, and political interference. As a result, threats emerging from distant frontiers were often underestimated or misunderstood. Meanwhile, on the edges of this divided world, a new force was rising. With a level of coordination and speed that no fragmented state could match. The lack of unity meant that intelligence about this force remained scattered and incomplete, creating dangerous blind spots. Still, inside Baghdad, many believed the city's historical prestige would act as protection. Its legacy, its scholarship, and its spiritual importance were seen as shields against collapse. But history does not protect systems that no longer protect themselves. And far beyond the fractured political landscape, something far more disciplined and unified was already moving, silently reshaping the balance of power across continents. Chapter 3: The Shadow of the Mongols. They did not arrive like an empire. They arrived like a force of nature that had learned how to think. Long before their armies reached the gates of Baghdad, the world had already begun to feel their absence as a warning. The death of Genghis Khan did not slow the machine he created. Instead, it multiplied. What had begun as a single, unifying vision on the Eurasian steppe transformed into one of history's most efficient expansion systems. Under his successors, the Mongol political structure did not fragment. It adapted. Unlike traditional empires that relied on slow administration and inherited bureaucracy, the Mongol system was built on mobility, discipline, and absolute military coordination. Power was not tied to geography. It moved with the army. Within a generation after Genghis Khan's death, his descendants expanded control across an unprecedented stretch of territory. From the Korean peninsula to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to the edges of the Middle East, no natural barrier could reliably stop their advance. Rivers, deserts, and mountains were not obstacles. They were logistical problems to be solved. At the center of this expansion stood a new generation of commanders, trained in a doctrine of total warfare. Among them was Hulagu Khan, tasked with pushing the empire's influence deep into the Islamic heartlands. His campaign was not spontaneous. It was strategic, calculated, and supported by the full administrative weight of the Mongol state. What made the Mongol advance so destabilizing was not just speed, but intelligence. They built one of the most effective information networks of the medieval world. Scouts, envoys, and captured informants created a constant flow of real-time intelligence. Cities were not approached blindly. They were studied in advance, their defenses mapped long before the first siege began. Across the regions bordering the Islamic world, fear began to travel faster than armies. Traders carried fragmented stories. Entire cities surrendering without resistance, fortified walls collapsing under coordinated siege engines, rulers executed after failed negotiations. Some reports were exaggerated, others incomplete, but together they created a psychological pressure that preceded physical invasion. Importantly, the Mongols did not operate as chaotic raiders. They were organized, hierarchical, and brutally efficient. Surrendered cities were often spared and integrated into their system. Resistance, however, was met with overwhelming force. This dual policy, mercy for submission, destruction for defiance, spread uncertainty faster than conquest itself. In many border regions, local leaders struggled to interpret the threat correctly. Some believed the Mongols were just another nomadic force that could be negotiated with or delayed. Others underestimated their capacity for sustained siege warfare. Few understood that this was not a temporary raid, but a coordinated imperial expansion with long-term objectives. As Mongol influence expanded westward, the geopolitical map began to lose its old boundaries. Traditional powers found themselves reacting too slowly to a force that never paused. Every delay in decision-making widened the gap between perception and reality. And while distant courts debated the nature of this new power, the Mongol machine continued to advance, quiet, structured, and relentlessly focused on the next horizon. Chapter 4: Hulagu Khan's Mission. It was not announced with drums. It was decided in silence and carried out like a mathematical certainty. Some orders change history not because they are loud, but because they are final. Deep within the structured hierarchy of the Mongol leadership, a strategic decision was made that would redirect the fate of the Middle East. The responsibility was placed on one man, Hulagu Khan. His mission was not exploratory, not diplomatic, and not temporary. It was designed as a permanent solution to a long-standing political target. The objective was clear: dismantle the remaining authority of the Abbasid center and bring the Western Islamic territories under Mongol control. Unlike earlier campaigns driven by rapid conquest alone, this operation was planned with institutional depth. Hulagu was not sent as a raider. He was appointed as an enforcer of imperial restructuring. His forces included not only cavalry units, but also engineers, siege specialists, and administrators trained to govern newly acquired regions. This was a different kind of warfare, systematic, calculated, and fully resourced by the Mongol imperial network that had evolved since the time of Genghis Khan. Where earlier expansions relied on momentum, this one relied on preparation. Hulagu's march westward was accompanied by deliberate political signaling. Envoys were sent ahead of the army, offering terms that were designed to test loyalty, compliance, and resistance. These were not negotiations in the traditional sense. They were structured evaluations of submission. Each response determined the level of force that would follow. As the campaign progressed, the Mongol force began integrating regional intelligence systems into its own command structure. Captured territories provided logistical maps, supply routes, and political insights that strengthened subsequent advances. Every conquered region became a stepping stone for the next operation. The Abbasid capital, Baghdad, was not initially treated as an immediate target of destruction. Instead, it was assessed as a strategic node, politically symbolic, economically significant, and structurally vulnerable due to its internal fragmentation. Intelligence reports highlighted not just its wealth, but its weakened coordination with surrounding regions. Within Hulagu's campaign framework, Baghdad represented more than a city. It was considered the final administrative anchor of a declining system. Neutralizing it would not only remove a political authority, but also send a structural message across neighboring territories. What made this mission particularly effective was its timing. The Mongol expansion had already destabilized surrounding regions. Trade disruptions, shifting alliances, and localized conflicts had weakened the broader defensive cohesion of the Middle East. Hulagu's forces were entering a landscape already under pressure. Internally, the Mongol command structure maintained strict discipline. Orders flowed in clear chains of authority, minimizing ambiguity in execution. This operational clarity contrasted sharply with the fragmented governance systems they were advancing toward. By the time Hulagu's campaign reached its operational stage, the outcome was no longer framed as uncertain within Mongol strategy circles. It was treated as a procedural step in a larger transformation of the region. And as the army moved closer to the heart of the Abbasid world, the next phase would not depend on strength alone, but on how a city built on centuries of legacy would respond when confronted by a force that treated history itself as something to be rewritten. Chapter 5: The Final Warning. A single decision, made with the wrong assumptions can turn history into irreversible consequence. By the time Mongol forces approached the outskirts of the Abbasid heartland, the political atmosphere inside Baghdad was already under immense strain. The city still projected confidence through its architecture, markets, and scholarly life, but its leadership faced a challenge unlike any it had encountered in previous generations. At the center of authority stood Caliph al-Mustasim. His position carried centuries of symbolic legitimacy, but the nature of the threat demanded more than symbolism. It required unified strategy, military coordination, and regional cooperation, systems that had been weakened over time. When Mongol envoys arrived with formal demands, the encounter was not simply diplomatic. It was a test of perception. The message delivered by Hulagu Khan was structured with deliberate clarity. Submission would ensure preservation. Resistance would trigger total confrontation. Inside the Abbasid court, interpretations of this warning varied sharply. Some advisors recognized the scale of the external threat, emphasizing the Mongols' record of systematic conquest across Eurasia. Others believed that Baghdad's historical prestige, religious significance, and fortified defenses would deter any prolonged siege. This internal division became the first critical weakness. Diplomatic exchanges continued, but instead of producing clarity, they deepened misjudgment. The caliph's responses were shaped not only by strategic assessment, but also by political advisors who underestimated the operational capacity of the Mongol military system. Communication delays and filtered intelligence reports further distorted the reality of the situation. A key miscalculation emerged from the assumption that distance and supply limitations would restrict Mongol endurance. Traditional armies often struggled with extended campaigns far from logistical bases. However, this assumption did not account for the Mongols' adaptive supply networks, mobile command structure, and ability to integrate resources from conquered territories. Another error was the belief that negotiation could delay or redirect the campaign indefinitely. In previous regional conflicts, diplomatic maneuvering had often bought time or altered outcomes. But in this case, the Mongol strategy was not centered on negotiation. It was structured around predefined strategic objectives. As correspondence continued, the gap between perception and reality widened. Within Baghdad, confidence in the city's intellectual and cultural strength created a psychological buffer against urgency. Many believed that a center of such historical importance would not be subjected to total destruction. Outside the walls, however, Mongol preparations were no longer theoretical. Siege equipment was being assembled, supply lines secured, and operational units positioned with precision. The campaign had moved beyond the stage of warning. The final diplomatic exchanges marked a turning point. They were no longer about negotiation. They were about confirmation of intent. Once this phase concluded, the structure of events would no longer be reversible. And as the last messages were delivered across contested ground, both sides stood at the edge of a transition that would determine whether Baghdad remained a preserved legacy of civilization or became a warning etched into the timeline of history itself. Chapter 6: The Siege begins. The moment an army stops chasing and starts enclosing, survival turns into mathematics. When Mongol forces finally positioned themselves around Baghdad, the nature of the conflict changed instantly. This was no longer a distant threat discussed in courts or interpreted through fragmented reports. It had become a physical reality, measurable, visible, and absolute. Under the command structure of Hulagu Khan, the encirclement was executed with precision rather than chaos. The Mongol army did not simply arrive. It organized itself into a full perimeter system. Units were positioned to control every major route in and out of the city, effectively converting geography into containment. From that point forward, Baghdad was no longer connected to the outside world in any meaningful sense. Trade caravans that once flowed through the region ceased entirely. Markets inside the city began to feel the absence almost immediately. Essential goods, grain, metals, and foreign imports became increasingly difficult to obtain. Prices shifted rapidly, not because of scarcity alone, but because of uncertainty. Economic systems began reacting faster than administrative responses could stabilize them. More critically, communication was severed. Messages could no longer reliably leave the city, and intelligence from outside no longer reached its leadership in time to be actionable. In medieval warfare, this form of isolation was often more destructive than direct assault, because it removed the ability to adapt. The Mongol strategy emphasized this principle. Instead of rushing immediate destruction, they tightened control over movement and information. This created a controlled pressure environment in which the city was forced to operate under increasing internal strain. Within the walls, daily life began to change in subtle but irreversible ways. Confidence in continuity weakened. Administrative offices struggled to coordinate responses. The assumption that the situation could be resolved through negotiation or delay began to collapse under practical conditions. The surrounding terrain itself became part of the siege architecture. Rivers and land routes were monitored and controlled, limiting both escape and reinforcement. The city's natural connection points, once advantages for trade and expansion, had been transformed into strategic vulnerabilities. Psychological pressure intensified alongside physical isolation. The knowledge that the surrounding forces were disciplined, organized, and methodical created a sense of inevitability among many inhabitants. Unlike earlier regional conflicts, there was no visible fragmentation in the opposing force that could be exploited. Inside the Abbasid administrative structure, efforts were made to maintain order and morale, but coordination challenges grew as external inputs diminished. Decision-making became reactive rather than strategic, shaped by incomplete information and delayed reports. Meanwhile, the Mongol encirclement remained stable. There was no indication of withdrawal or hesitation. The operational objective was not short-term confrontation, but sustained containment until the city's internal systems weakened sufficiently. At this stage, the siege was not defined by battle. It was defined by control. Every day that passed without external contact deepened the imbalance between the city's internal capacity and the pressure surrounding it. And as the encirclement tightened, Baghdad entered a phase where its greatest challenge was no longer resisting an attack, but enduring a condition designed to make resistance itself increasingly unsustainable. Chapter 7. The Breaking of the Walls. Walls do not fall when they are struck once. They fall when every system behind them stops believing they can stand. By the time direct assault operations began against Baghdad, the siege had already reshaped the city's reality. What remained was not a sudden clash, but a calculated dismantling of defenses that had once been considered among the most formidable in the region. Under the command framework of Hulagu Khan, the attacking forces transitioned from containment to structural destruction. The objective was no longer simply to hold the perimeter. It was to systematically break the city's physical and psychological capacity to resist. One of the key tactical advantages deployed during this phase was the use of large-scale siege engines. These machines were designed to apply continuous pressure on fortified positions, targeting defensive walls that had been constructed over generations. Unlike conventional assaults, this was not dependent on short bursts of force, but on sustained mechanical impact over time. At the same time, engineering strategies were employed to manipulate the natural environment surrounding the city. Water systems, particularly those connected to the surrounding river network, were redirected and disrupted. This altered both the defensive landscape and the internal functioning of the city. Agriculture, transport, and basic infrastructure began to experience cascading failures as water access became inconsistent and unpredictable. The combination of mechanical siege pressure and environmental disruption created a multi-layered strain on Baghdad's defensive structure. Walls that had once symbolized permanence were now subjected to continuous stress from both external force and internal instability. However, the most significant transformation during this phase was not purely physical. It was psychological. As siege operations intensified, uncertainty within the city deepened. Defensive positions required coordination, morale, and consistent communication. But prolonged isolation had already weakened these elements. Reports of breaches, resource shortages, and structural damage circulated faster than verified responses could be organized. This information imbalance created an environment where perception itself became a weapon. Even limited breaches or localized failures had disproportionate psychological effects, amplifying the sense of inevitability among defenders. Inside the command structure of Baghdad, efforts were made to reinforce resistance and maintain order. Yet coordination challenges had increased significantly since the start of the encirclement. Decision-making was often reactive, shaped by incomplete situational awareness and rapidly changing conditions on multiple fronts. The attacking forces, by contrast, operated with strategic consistency. Their pressure was not designed to produce immediate collapse in a single moment, but to gradually reduce the structural integrity of both defenses and morale. Each phase of pressure built upon the previous one. As time progressed, sections of the defensive perimeter began to lose their functional effectiveness. Not all at once, but in fragmented failures that accumulated faster than they could be repaired. This fragmentation marked a critical transition point in siege dynamics. At this stage, the city was no longer defending a stable perimeter. It was managing multiple simultaneous breakdowns across its systems. And as the structural integrity of the defenses continued to erode, Baghdad moved closer to a point where the question was no longer whether the walls would hold, but how long the remaining cohesion inside the city could withstand the pressure closing in from every direction. Chapter 8: The Fall of the Caliph. When leadership breaks, the city does not fall all at once. It falls in pieces, starting from the center. Inside the final stages of the siege of Baghdad, the collapse was no longer about walls or weapons. It had shifted into something far more decisive: the disintegration of authority itself. The political center that once held the Abbasid system together had become increasingly isolated under the pressure of continuous external operations led by Hulagu Khan. What began as a military campaign had evolved into a complete breakdown of command cohesion within the city. At the core of this system stood Caliph al-Mustasim, whose position carried centuries of inherited legitimacy. Yet legitimacy alone could not compensate for the loss of functional control. As defensive structures weakened and internal coordination fragmented, the authority of the court began to lose practical influence over events unfolding across the city. What made this moment critical was not a single defeat, but the accumulation of failures across multiple layers of governance. Communication between military units and administrative offices became inconsistent. Orders issued from the center were increasingly difficult to execute in real time. In some cases, responses arrived too late to affect outcomes already decided on the ground. As pressure intensified, internal divisions within the leadership structure became more visible. Advisors and commanders struggled to maintain unified strategy. Some advocated continued resistance, believing that persistence could alter the outcome. Others recognized that the remaining defensive capacity was no longer sufficient to reverse the situation. This divergence in interpretation created operational paralysis at a time when coordination was essential. The city's leadership, once capable of managing a vast intellectual and administrative network, now faced a rapidly contracting sphere of influence. On the external front, Mongol operations maintained their structured approach. Rather than rushing a singular decisive assault, they continued applying controlled pressure across multiple points of vulnerability. This sustained approach ensured that no single defensive recovery could restore overall stability. Within this environment, the authority of the caliph gradually transitioned from active governance to symbolic presence. Decisions that once shaped regional policy now had limited practical impact on immediate military realities. The center of decision-making had effectively shifted away from the city itself. As conditions deteriorated further, the remaining defensive framework lost coherence. Units that had once operated under a unified command structure began functioning in isolated pockets. Coordination between them weakened as information flow became increasingly disrupted. At this stage, the concept of resistance was no longer defined by strategic planning, but by fragmented endurance. The system was no longer capable of initiating coordinated action at scale. The fall did not occur as a single dramatic moment. It emerged through a sequence of cascading failures that converged on the leadership structure. Once that structure could no longer function as a unifying force, the remaining elements of the city lost their collective direction. And as the final mechanisms of authority ceased to operate effectively, Baghdad crossed a threshold where its fate was no longer being negotiated or defended, but was already being resolved by forces that had outpaced its ability to respond. Chapter 9: The River of Ink and Blood. History remembers wars by who won, but civilizations remember them by what was lost forever. When control inside Baghdad finally collapsed, what followed was not just military occupation. It was a systematic unraveling of the city's intellectual core. The structures that had preserved centuries of accumulated knowledge were no longer protected by any functioning authority. Among the most significant centers of learning was the House of Wisdom. It had stood as a repository of translation, research, and scholarship, where texts from across the known world were preserved, analyzed, and expanded. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, and Arabic scientific thought had all converged within its walls. During the final phase of the Mongol campaign under Hulagu Khan, these institutions became exposed to irreversible destruction. As order broke down across the city, libraries and scholarly centers were no longer functioning as protected spaces of learning. Historical accounts describe a rapid and devastating dismantling of manuscript collections. Vast quantities of handwritten works, covering medicine, engineering, philosophy, and literature, were removed from storage systems that had taken generations to build. In many cases, preservation was not possible due to the scale and speed of the collapse. The loss was not limited to physical destruction of buildings. The scholarly ecosystem that had sustained Baghdad's intellectual identity was effectively dissolved. Teachers, scribes, translators, and researchers, individuals who had formed the living infrastructure of knowledge, were displaced, silenced, or scattered. One of the most enduring images associated with this period is the reported disposal of manuscripts into the river system. While accounts vary in detail, the symbolic outcome remains consistent across historical narratives. Knowledge that had been carefully preserved over centuries was rendered physically inaccessible in a matter of days. The metaphor of ink dissolving into water became a defining representation of this moment in history. It reflected not only loss, but irreversibility. Unlike material wealth, intellectual heritage cannot be quickly reconstructed once dispersed at scale. What made this destruction historically significant was not only its intensity, but its concentration. Few cities in medieval history had accumulated such a dense archive of cross-cultural knowledge. The sudden collapse of that archive created a discontinuity in intellectual transmission that would be felt far beyond the region. At the same time, the Mongol system itself was not focused on preserving existing scholarly institutions during active conflict phases. Their operational priority was territorial consolidation and strategic control. As a result, many cultural and academic structures that were not integrated into that framework were not maintained. Inside the aftermath of the collapse, Baghdad's identity shifted rapidly. The city that had once functioned as a global center of intellectual exchange was now in a state of structural transformation. Its scholarly networks were no longer centralized, and its accumulated knowledge base had been severely disrupted. And as the waters of the river carried away what remained of centuries of recorded thought, the world crossed an invisible boundary. One where the loss was no longer just about a city's fall, but about the fragmentation of a shared human memory that could never be fully restored. Chapter 10. The World After Silence. Silence is never empty. It is what remains when everything that gave a place its voice is gone. After the storm of destruction passed through Baghdad, what remained was not simply a conquered capital, but a transformed landscape of history. The city still stood in form, yet its function had been fundamentally altered. Administrative continuity, scholarly networks, and political authority had all been disrupted beyond recovery in their previous structure. The end of the Abbasid political lineage marked a definitive transition. The institution that had shaped centuries of governance across the Islamic world ceased to operate as a functioning center of power. With the collapse of the caliphate's authority, a long-standing era of unified symbolic leadership came to a close. In the immediate aftermath, the region was absorbed into the expanding administrative framework established under Hulagu Khan. Governance shifted from inherited dynastic legitimacy to a system structured around Mongol imperial organization. This transition redefined how authority was distributed, enforced, and maintained across the former Abbasid territories. Economically, the disruption was equally profound. Trade routes that had once connected Baghdad to distant markets required reconfiguration under new political conditions. Commercial activity did not disappear entirely, but it operated under altered security, taxation, and administrative frameworks. The flow of goods became dependent on new power structures rather than traditional networks. Culturally and intellectually, the long-term impact was even more significant. The fragmentation of scholarly institutions meant that knowledge production no longer remained concentrated in a single metropolitan center. Instead, intellectual activity began to disperse across multiple regions, gradually reshaping the geography of learning in the broader world. This decentralization did not eliminate knowledge, but it changed its structure. Future centers of scholarship would emerge elsewhere, influenced indirectly by what had been preserved, adapted, or reconstructed from the legacy of Baghdad's intellectual tradition. Politically, the Mongol expansion demonstrated a new model of continental-scale integration. Unlike earlier empires that relied heavily on assimilation into pre-existing administrative traditions, this system introduced a more layered structure of regional governance under centralized strategic control. It redefined how vast territories could be coordinated across distance and diversity. The psychological impact of the fall extended far beyond the region itself. Across neighboring states and distant courts, the event became a reference point for both fear and adaptation. Military strategies, defensive planning, and diplomatic approaches were reassessed in response to the demonstrated capabilities of Mongol expansion. Yet, even within this transformation, no system remains permanent. The same mechanisms that enabled rapid expansion also required continuous adaptation to maintain stability over time. History shows that large-scale imperial systems eventually evolve, fragment, or restructure under their own internal pressures. What remained constant was the magnitude of the shift. The fall of Baghdad did not simply close a chapter. It altered the framework through which power, knowledge, and continuity were understood across continents. And in the silence that followed, the world did not stop moving. It reorganized itself around the absence, carrying forward the memory of a city that once stood at the center of global thought, and the moment when that center was permanently redefined. An empire that once ruled half the world is now tearing itself apart. From unity to chaos, power begins to break in silence. Tonight, the Mongol Empire enters its darkest transformation. On Midnight Empire, we don't just tell history, we bring collapsing worlds back to life. This is the story of what happens after greatness fades and ambition turns inward. Tonight, the rise, born from fragmentation, the Golden Horde emerges. Chapter 1: The Death of Unity. The greatest empire the world had ever seen did not collapse in fire or battle. It began with silence, a silence that spread faster than any army. Across the endless Mongol steppes, riders once carried the will of a single unstoppable force. Decisions made in one center, obeyed across continents. From the frozen north to the burning deserts of the west, everything moved under one command. One voice, one system, one empire. Then that voice disappeared. No trumpet announced the end. No enemy claimed victory. There was only absence, heavy, unsettling, and absolute. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The borders still held. The tribute still arrived. The armies still marched. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had broken. The chain of command that once turned scattered tribes into a world-conquering machine. Messages began to travel slower. Orders returned with hesitation instead of certainty. Local commanders stopped waiting for instructions that no longer came with clarity. The empire was still alive, but it was no longer one body. It was becoming many. In the capital regions, couriers arrived with conflicting directives, each stamped with authority that no longer aligned. What was once unquestionable law became interpretation. And interpretation, in an empire this large, was the first crack in control. Far from the center, provincial rulers began to look inward. Security became local. Loyalty became conditional. The vast unity that once erased distance now depended on it. The steppe itself did not change, but its meaning did. Where there was once direction, there was now uncertainty. Where there was once unity, there was now calculation. And in that vacuum, power began to shift, not through conquest, but through hesitation. Because an empire built on absolute coordination cannot survive when coordination weakens, even slightly. It does not fall instantly. It unravels, quietly, thread by thread, decision by decision. No one yet called it collapse. But those who understood power knew something irreversible had begun. The empire was no longer moving as one. And in history, that moment has only one name: the death of unity. Chapter 2: The Succession Crisis after Genghis Khan. Power does not disappear when a ruler is gone. It fractures. And in the vast Mongol world, that fracture began the moment the architecture of authority could no longer point to a single supreme will. There was no enemy at the gates, no rebellion sweeping across the steppes. Instead, something far more dangerous emerged: competing legitimacy. The empire still recognized the legacy of its founder, but it could no longer agree on who carried it forward. Bloodline, merit, military control, regional influence, each became a different argument for the same throne. What followed was not a sudden war, but a slow collision of expectations. Courts that once executed unified decisions now became arenas of calculation. Commanders who once obeyed without question began measuring advantage before loyalty. Every faction believed it was preserving the empire. Each claimed continuity, yet each interpretation pulled the system in a different direction. Messages from different power centers began contradicting one another. One region would prepare for expansion, while another consolidated defense. One court would demand obedience, while another offered autonomy in exchange for stability. The empire had not split yet, but it had started negotiating with itself. In this environment, authority became something that had to be proven, not inherited. And proof in an empire built on conquest meant armies, alliances, and control of communication routes. The silence of a single voice was now replaced by the noise of many ambitions. What made this moment dangerous was not open rebellion. It was the absence of consensus. Because when everyone believes they have a rightful claim, no single structure can remain stable for long. Caravans carried not just goods, but rumors of shifting loyalties. Military camps became places of discussion instead of obedience. Even distant provinces began to anticipate independence disguised as loyalty. And still, no one declared separation. They all believed unity could be restored, if only the right leader emerged. But history rarely waits for agreement. It advances through momentum. And in that momentum, the Mongol world was already moving away from its center of gravity, without realizing it had begun to fall in different directions at once. The empire had survived the absence of its founder, but it had not survived the question he left behind. Who now has the right to command the world he once ruled alone? Chapter 3. The Empire Without a Supreme Khan. A world-spanning empire does not simply collapse when its center weakens. It adapts. And what emerged next was something no one in Eurasia had ever seen before. A conquest machine still running, without a single hand on its command. There was no supreme authority issuing final decisions, no universally accepted center of power. Yet the system continued to function, as if guided by inertia alone. Armies still moved, tax routes still operated, trade networks still stretched across deserts, rivers, and mountain passes. But every action now depended on regional judgment, rather than unified command. The empire had not stopped working. It had stopped agreeing with itself. Each administrative zone began to operate like an independent engine. Local governors interpreted old directives according to present needs. Military leaders adjusted objectives based on geography, supply lines, and opportunity. What once required coordination now required improvisation. And somehow it worked, at least on the surface. Caravans continued their long journeys across continents under varying rules of passage. One region demanded strict tribute schedules, while another allowed flexible arrangements to maintain stability. Inconsistency became the new order, but order still existed. The most striking change was psychological. Officials no longer looked upward for instruction. They looked sideways, toward neighboring regions, toward shifting balances of strength, toward survival logic. Power, once centralized, had become distributed across distance. But distribution is not unity. It is fragmentation disguised as function. The empire's scale now worked against itself. Messages traveled too far to remain consistent. Enforcement depended too heavily on local loyalty. And loyalty, without a single center to anchor it, became conditional everywhere. Still, no formal break was declared. No official proclamation ended the structure. Instead, the empire continued to exist in administrative memory, like a body still moving after the mind has fractured. From afar, it still appeared whole. Maps still drew it as a single color. Merchants still described it as one system. But those inside knew the truth. They were no longer serving one authority. They were managing their own versions of it. And in that contradiction, a new reality quietly formed. An empire can survive without a supreme ruler, but it cannot remain unchanged. Because once authority becomes local, ambition becomes inevitable. And once ambition becomes inevitable, the question is no longer whether the empire will split, but how many centers it will eventually produce. Chapter 4. Brothers divided, thrones collapsing. It did not begin as war. It began as refusal. A refusal to accept that any single authority could define the future of a world once held together by obedience alone. Across the fractured Mongol domains, regional rulers who had once acted as extensions of a single system now stepped forward as sovereign powers. They did not announce rebellion. They announced continuity, each insisting they were the true inheritor of legitimacy. But legitimacy cannot be shared forever. What followed was not a sudden explosion, but a chain reaction of political separation. Administrative loyalty, once fluid across vast distances, hardened into borders shaped by military control and economic survival. What had once been a network of command became a field of competing centers. Each emerging power built its own court, its own rules of succession, its own interpretation of inherited authority. Symbols of unity were preserved, but their meaning changed depending on who controlled them. Messages that once unified decisions now confirmed division. A directive issued in one region carried no binding force in another. Diplomacy replaced coordination. Negotiation replaced command. The empire's structure, once vertical and absolute, had flattened into parallel ambitions. In some regions, rulers leaned on military strength to assert dominance. In others, administrative control and taxation systems became the foundation of independence. Everywhere, authority was no longer assumed, it was enforced, and enforcement created boundaries. Those boundaries slowly solidified into khanates, each claiming rightful continuity, each rejecting the idea that the others could represent the same legacy. What made this stage irreversible was not conflict itself, but normalization. Separation was no longer treated as betrayal. It was treated as governance. The shared identity that once erased geography now fractured under the weight of distance and interpretation. Even language of power changed. Loyalty became regional, protection became conditional, and allegiance became negotiable. Still, echoes of unity remained. Rituals were copied, titles were repeated. The memory of a single empire lingered like a shadow no one could fully erase. But shadows do not hold systems together. They only remind them of what they used to be. And as each khanate stabilized its own center of gravity, the illusion of a single empire finally gave way to reality. Not one throne, but many. And each throne, once dependent on the same foundation, now stood alone, competing, contradicting, and slowly collapsing into its own definition of power. Chapter 5. The Division of the Four Khanates. The empire did not explode. It organized its own fracture. What once stretched as a single political horizon across continents now resolved into four dominant power centers, each too large to collapse, yet too independent to obey. This was no longer fragmentation in chaos. It was fragmentation in structure. Each khanate emerged from the same imperial system, but adapted it into something distinct. They inherited the same administrative DNA, taxation networks, military organization, courier systems, but they no longer shared a common decision point. Geography became destiny. In the eastern core, authority consolidated around the original imperial heartlands, where tradition carried more weight than expansion. In the western steppe corridors, mobility and military pressure defined governance. To the southwest, control was shaped by trade routes and urban taxation. Farther north, territorial expansion followed river systems and frontier control. All four operated with the same imperial logic, but with no shared command to unify their outcomes. What changed everything was not their existence, but their independence from one another. For the first time, policies that once synchronized across the empire now diverged permanently. One khanate prioritized consolidation, another prioritized conquest. Another prioritized economic extraction, and another prioritized frontier stabilization. These were not temporary disagreements. They became structural identities. Diplomatic contact replaced administrative coordination. Agreements had to be negotiated from scratch, even between former internal regions. Borders, once meaningless inside the empire, now required definition, defense, and enforcement. And enforcement created distance. Even shared heritage became a political tool. Each Khanate framed itself as the rightful continuation of the original order, not a successor, but the successor. That contradiction ensured rivalry would persist even without open conflict. The most dangerous shift was psychological. Rulers no longer thought in terms of restoring unity. They thought in terms of maintaining survival. Because once a system learns to function independently, unity becomes optional, and eventually irrelevant. Yet beneath this new structure, an invisible tension remained. The four Khanates were not truly separate civilizations. They were still connected by origin, by memory, and by an administrative past that no border could fully erase. That connection did not prevent division, it made it permanent. And as each Khanate stabilized its own authority, the Mongol world reached a point of no return. Not the end of an empire, but the beginning of multiple empires born from the same collapse. Chapter 6: The Western Steppes in Turmoil. The frontier did not fall in a single war. It unraveled through constant motion, leaders rising faster than stability could form, and power changing hands before it could ever settle. In the Western Steppes, authority became temporary by nature. A commander today could be replaced by tomorrow's stronger coalition. Control was no longer inherited or negotiated. It was seized, tested, and lost in rapid succession. What made this region unstable was not absence of governance, but overload of competing ambitions. Multiple power holders operated within overlapping territories, each with enough force to challenge the others, but none strong enough to eliminate resistance completely. The result was a landscape defined by shifting dominance rather than fixed borders. Military groups no longer fought for a unified command. They fought for control of movement, routes, crossings, and seasonal migration corridors that determined economic survival. Whoever controlled mobility controlled authority, even if only briefly. Cities and settlements adapted quickly. They learned to recognize power not by titles, but by presence. A new banner on the horizon meant new taxes, new demands, new terms of survival. Loyalty became a reaction to immediate force rather than long-term allegiance. In this environment, leadership was no longer stable identity. It was performance under pressure. Some leaders rose through military success, only to collapse when supply lines stretched too thin. Others gained control through negotiation, only to lose it when stronger forces arrived. Power here was not built, it was cycled. What intensified the instability was the absence of a single external arbitrator. No central authority existed to settle disputes or enforce hierarchy. Every conflict resolved itself locally, through immediate advantage rather than lasting agreement. As a result, the Western Steppes became a corridor of continuous recalibration. Alliances formed and dissolved within seasons. Control maps changed faster than records could be updated. Even experienced commanders treated territory as temporary possession rather than permanent rule. Yet beneath the chaos, a pattern slowly emerged. Among the competing forces, one particular structure began to stabilize its influence. Not through sudden conquest, but through repeated persistence. It did not announce dominance, it accumulated it. And in a region where everything was temporary, consistency became the most powerful form of control. The western steppes were not simply in turmoil, they were being reshaped by instability itself, until one force began to turn motion into structure, and structure into long-term authority. But at this stage, no one yet recognized what was forming beneath the chaos, only that the balance of power was no longer shifting randomly, it was beginning to lean. Chapter 7. The Rise of the Golden Horde. It did not rise like an empire. It rose like pressure, building beneath unstable ground, silent, invisible, and impossible to ignore once it began to move. In the Western Dominion, where authority had long been temporary and contested, one emerging power began to do something different. It did not chase every conflict. It did not expand in all directions. Instead, it selected, stabilized, and absorbed, turning fragmented control into a structured hierarchy. This was the beginning of consolidation. At first, it appeared modest compared to older imperial memories. It controlled fewer cities, fewer routes, fewer visible symbols of dominance. But what it lacked in scale, it compensated with consistency. Decisions were no longer reactive. They became procedural. Local administrations were reorganized under a clearer chain of command. Tribute systems were standardized rather than negotiated repeatedly. Military presence was distributed strategically instead of constantly redeployed. For the first time in this region, authority began to feel predictable. That predictability changed everything. Merchants preferred routes that offered stability over those promising lower cost but higher risk. Settlements aligned themselves with structures that did not change with every season. Even rival commanders began to recognize that this emerging power did not dissolve after conflict. It absorbed the outcome and continued forward. Identity followed structure. What had been a loose collection of military governors and regional controllers gradually formed a coherent political body, not defined by expansion alone, but by internal discipline. The name that began to circulate among observers was not immediately official. It was descriptive at first, a way to distinguish this stable Western authority from the surrounding volatility. Over time, that description hardened into recognition. Golden Horde. What made it distinct was not simply territorial control, but administrative endurance. It could withstand leadership changes without collapsing its system. It could absorb external pressure without losing internal coherence. In a landscape defined by instability, it became an exception. Yet its rise was not separate from the chaos around it. It was shaped by it. Every period of disorder in the surrounding steppes reinforced the need for a structure that could outlast temporary power shifts. Still, consolidation came with its own consequence. Definition invites resistance. As identity solidified, so did external awareness of its strength. Neighboring powers no longer viewed it as a temporary authority. They began to measure it as a lasting force. And in that recognition, something subtle changed. The Western steppe was no longer a space of shifting control. It now had a center of gravity. And once a center of gravity forms, the region no longer drifts freely. It begins to orbit. Chapter 8. The Shadow over the Rus lands. It did not arrive like an invasion. It arrived like a system of pressure that never fully lifted. When influence extended northward from the Western power center, The Rus principalities did not face a single decisive battle that defined their fate. Instead, they encountered a new reality: control expressed through repetition, administration, and relentless extraction. The first sign was not destruction, it was demand. Envoys carried structured obligations into cities that had long operated under their own fragmented rule. These were not requests. They were calculations of obligation, enforced with the certainty of organized power behind them. Compliance became measurable. Failure became punishable. And punishment did not always require presence. It required expectation. What made this influence different from earlier incursions was its predictability. It did not depend on seasonal raids or opportunistic campaigns. It functioned through cycles: assessment, collection, enforcement, and return. Local rulers quickly learned that resistance did not erase obligation. It only delayed consequence. As the system deepened its reach, governance in the region began to shift inward. Cities that once focused on rivalries among themselves now redirected their attention toward managing external demands. Internal disputes became secondary to external structure. Economic life adapted first. Trade routes were reorganized to align with controlled corridors. Resources were redirected to meet fixed requirements rather than local priorities. Over time, taxation became less an event and more an environment. This environment reshaped authority itself. Leadership was no longer judged by conquest or charisma, but by capacity to manage extraction under pressure. Survival depended on administration, not expansion. And administration does not require visibility to be effective. What emerged across the Rus lands was not uniform occupation, but layered control, thin in presence, heavy in consequence. The landscape remained politically fragmented, but economically synchronized under an external framework. Fear was not always expressed through violence. It was embedded in structure. The certainty that obligations would return, regardless of delay, negotiation, or distance. Over time, even resistance adapted. Some rulers chose compliance as strategy rather than defeat. Others attempted negotiation within the system rather than opposition to it. But the structure itself remained unchanged. It did not need to constantly expand. It only needed to remain consistent. And consistency, in a fragmented world, becomes indistinguishable from permanence. By the time its influence was fully recognized, the region was no longer reacting to occasional incursions. It was operating within an imposed rhythm, a rhythm that did not belong to the Rus lands, but now defined them. Chapter 9: A New Order from the Ashes. It did not feel like an ending. It felt like the moment when chaos finally learned how to hold its shape. Across the fractured Mongol world, something unexpected began to emerge. Not a return to the old unity, but a different kind of stability built from everything that had broken apart. For years, the system had survived through separation, multiple centers of power, independent administrations, regional identities, and overlapping spheres of control. What once was a single empire had become a collection of functioning structures that no longer depended on one another to exist. Now, those structures began to settle. Not merge, not reunite, but stabilize. The difference was subtle, yet absolute. Each dominant power center refined its internal mechanisms. Administrative practices became more precise. Governance systems became more self-contained. Instead of expansion defining authority, maintenance became the core logic of rule. Power was no longer measured by how far it reached, but by how reliably it sustained what it already held. This shift changed the nature of competition. The era of rapid territorial reconfiguration slowed into calculated endurance. Conflicts still existed, but they no longer reshaped the entire system. They adjusted it at the edges. What once was a single imperial identity had transformed into a geopolitical framework of inherited influence. Shared origins still connected these powers, but shared command no longer existed and was no longer required. Even trade and movement adapted to this new reality. Long-distance exchange persisted, but through negotiated channels rather than unified routes. Information flowed through parallel networks, each shaped by the authority it passed through. In this environment, legitimacy was no longer a single source. It was distributed across multiple recognized centers, each validating its own continuity. The idea of a unified empire did not return. Instead, a new equilibrium formed, one that accepted division as permanent architecture rather than temporary failure. What had once been collapse was now structure, and what had once been fragmentation was now order. Yet this order carried the memory of its own instability. It was not fragile, but it was conscious of fragility. Every system that emerged understood what had come before it, and therefore operated with restraint shaped by history. The ashes of the old world did not disappear. They became the foundation of the new one. And in that transformation, the Mongol legacy did not end. It changed form. From a single conquering force into a lasting system of powers, forever linked by origin, yet permanently divided by destiny. Now that the Mongol world has fractured into multiple powers and a new order has emerged from the ashes, centuries have passed, but the shadow of the Mongol Empire still stretches across the modern world. Borders were redrawn, trade routes were transformed, and entire civilizations were forced into a new era of connection and conflict. From military strategy to global communication networks, echoes of the Mongol system still influence how nations move today. What began as a storm on the steppe did not simply vanish, it evolved into legacy. In the end, the Mongols were not just conquerors of land, but architects of a connected world. Their empire fell apart, but its impact never did. And even now, history carries the silence of horses, the dust of conquest, and the memory of an empire that once shook the world. Subscribe to Midnight Empire and join us for a journey through history, empires, and untold stories.